I remember that day with painful clarity, the kind that etches itself into your memory like acid on metal. It was raining in Boston, a cold November drizzle that seemed to seep through my jacket and into my bones as I stood watching Olivia pack the last of her things into her sleek silver BMW. "I never thought it would end like this," I said, my voice barely audible above the patter of rain against the windows of my South End apartment. Olivia didn't even look up as she folded a cashmere sweater I'd given her for our second anniversary. "What did you expect, Michael? That I'd wait forever while you chase architectural pipe dreams?" Her tone was clinical, detached, as if she were discussing a business transaction rather than dismantling 4 years of our life together. "I thought we were building something together," I replied, hating the pleading edge in my voice. "My firm is on the verge of landing the Harborfront project. Just a few more months and—" "Richard's already broken ground on 3 major developments this year," she interrupted, finally meeting my eyes. Hers were the color of winter sea, gray-blue and just as cold. "I'm 32, Michael. I can't keep waiting for your potential to materialize." Richard Blackwood, investment banker extraordinaire. The man who had been mentoring Olivia at the charity galas we'd attended together. I should have seen it coming when she started working late, when her texts became infrequent, when her kisses felt like obligations rather than desires. "So that's it?" He flashes his portfolio, "and 4 years mean nothing?" I asked, anger finally breaking through the numbness I'd been feeling since she'd announced her departure 3 days ago. She sighed, a sound of exquisite impatience. "It's not just the money, though God knows that matters. It's ambition, Michael. Richard knows what he wants and takes it." Her eyes flicked over our apartment. The modest furnishings, the architectural drawings covering the dining table, the bookcases crowded with novels and design books. "You're content with this?" "I want more." The words struck like physical blows. I'd been working 80-hour weeks trying to establish my own architectural firm, taking on commercial projects I didn't believe in to fund the innovative designs I was passionate about. All while believing Olivia understood, supported my vision. "I hope he makes you happy," I said finally, the words tasting like ash. A ghost of something, regret? Pity? Flickered across her face before her expression hardened again. "I need to be with someone successful, Michael. Someone who's already arrived, not still struggling to get there." She closed her suitcase with a decisive click and straightened her camel hair coat. "I've left my key on the counter." And then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft finality that seemed obscenely anticlimactic for the end of a 4-year relationship. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched her slide into her car and pull away without a backward glance. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty street, feeling hollowed out. The apartment seemed to echo with her absence. Half-empty closets, gaps on the bookshelves, the lingering scent of her perfume like a ghost taunting me with what was lost. My phone rang, startling me from my trance. A known number. I almost didn't answer, but some small part of me hoped it might be Olivia, already regretting her decision. "Hello." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "Mr. Harrington? Michael Harrington?" The voice was male, elderly, formal. "Speaking. This is Everett Chambers from Chambers, Hollingsworth and Witt. I'm afraid I have some news about your grandmother, Eleanor Harrington." My grandmother. The formidable, elegant woman who'd encouraged my love of architecture from the time I was 7, sketching buildings with crayons on her kitchen table. Who'd funded my education when my parents deemed architecture an impractical pursuit. Whose approval had always mattered more to me than anyone else's. "What's happened?" I asked, though I already knew. She'd been ill for months, though she'd forbidden me from telling anyone, even Olivia. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mrs. Harrington passed away yesterday evening. Peacefully in her sleep." I sank onto the couch, a fresh wave of loss washing over me. "I see. There is the matter of her will," Mr. Chambers continued. "She was quite specific that you should be contacted immediately upon her passing. Could you come to our offices tomorrow at 10? "Yes, of course," I replied automatically. "Very good. And Mr. Harrington? She left something for you. A letter. She was most insistent that you receive it as soon as possible." After hanging up, I sat in the growing darkness of the empty apartment, surrounded by the wreckage of one life and the echoes of another now gone. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. It seemed fitting somehow, this day of departures. The offices of Chambers, Hollingsworth, and Witt occupied the 10th floor of a stately brownstone in Boston's financial district. Rain continued to fall, transforming the streets into mirrors reflecting the gray October sky. I arrived 10 minutes early, soaked despite my umbrella, grief and exhaustion weighing on me like a physical burden. The receptionist, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, led me to a conference room where Everett Chambers waited. He was older than I expected, perhaps in his 70s, with wire-rimmed glasses and the dignified bearing of someone who had spent decades managing the affairs of Boston's elite. "Mr. Harrington," he said, rising to shake my hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Your grandmother spoke of you often and with great affection." "Thank you," I replied, taking the seat he indicated. The conference room was all old-world elegance. Mahogany table, leather chairs, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes. It reminded me of my grandmother's library. "We're waiting for just one more person before we begin," Chambers explained, checking his watch. Before I could ask who, the door opened and a woman entered. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to command. She wore a charcoal pantsuit, and a detective's badge gleamed at her waist. "Mr. Chambers, sorry I'm late. Traffic on Starrow Drive was a nightmare," she said, then turned to me. "You must be Michael. I'm Detective Diana Chin. I worked with your grandmother on several matters." My confusion must have shown on my face because Chambers quickly intervened. "Detective Chin was your grandmother's goddaughter, though I believe you two haven't met. Eleanor specifically requested her presence today." "My grandmother knew a detective?" I asked, trying to reconcile this new information with the elegant, somewhat reserved woman I'd known. Detective Chen's smile was enigmatic. "Eleanor and I had a complicated relationship. But she trusted me, which is why I'm here." She took a seat across from me. "I'm sorry for your loss. She was an extraordinary woman." Chambers cleared his throat and opened a leather portfolio. "Shall we proceed with the reading of Eleanor Harrington's last will and testament?" What followed was surreal. My grandmother, it seemed, had been far wealthier than I'd ever imagined. The elegant Beacon Hill mansion where I'd visited her growing up was just the beginning. There were investment portfolios, art collections, real estate holdings, and charitable foundations. And she had left everything to me. "This can't be right," I said, interrupting Chambers mid-sentence. "What about my parents? My father is her only child." Chambers and Detective Chin exchanged glances. "Your grandmother was quite specific," Chambers said carefully. "While she has arranged for certain family heirlooms to be returned to your parents, the bulk of her estate passes to you. She believed you would honor her legacy in ways others might not." I sat back stunned. My relationship with my parents had been strained since I'd chosen architecture over joining my father's law firm, but I'd never imagined my grandmother would disinherit them so completely. "There's more," Chambers continued, handing me an envelope. "As I mentioned, she left this for you. Her instructions were that you should read it privately before discussing the inheritance further." The envelope was heavy cream stationery, my name written in my grandmother's elegant script. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, not ready to read her final words in front of strangers. "The mansion on Beacon Hill has been maintained by staff in anticipation of your decision," Chambers continued. "Your grandmother was most insistent that everything remain exactly as she left it until you've had a chance to visit." "When can I see it?" I asked, feeling as though I were moving through a dream. "The keys are yours," Detective Chin said, sliding a small envelope across the table. "Eleanor asked me to secure the property personally after her passing." "There's one more thing," Chambers added, his expression grave. "Your grandmother requested that you exercise extreme discretion regarding your inheritance, at least initially. She believed there might be interested parties who would attempt to take advantage." "What do you mean?" I asked. Detective Chin leaned forward. "Your grandmother was investigating certain financial irregularities before her death. Nothing I can discuss officially, but she was concerned about potential repercussions." "What kinds of irregularities?" I pressed. "Investment fraud, possibly on a significant scale," she replied. "Eleanor was extraordinarily perceptive about people and their motivations. If she was concerned enough to warn you, I'd take that seriously." I thought of Olivia, who had walked out of my life just yesterday for a man with greater financial success. The timing seemed almost theatrical in its cruelty, or perhaps its irony. As if reading my thoughts, Detective Chin added, "She also left a file for you. Names, dates, connections she thought might be important. It's at the house in her study safe." "The combination?" I asked. "Your birth date," she replied with a sad smile. She never forgot what mattered most to her. I left the law offices an hour later, keys to a mansion in one pocket, my grandmother's letter in the other, and the weight of her expectations pressing down on me like the persistent Boston rain. 6 months passed. Winter yielded reluctantly to spring, and spring bloomed into a Boston summer that alternated between sweltering humidity and perfect, crystalline days. I spent those months in a curious state of suspended animation, dividing my time between my architectural firm, which had indeed landed the harborfront project, and my grandmother's Beacon Hill mansion. Following her advice, I kept my inheritance quiet. I maintained my modest South End apartment as my official residence while secretly renovating the mansion room by room. Each space revealed new facets of my grandmother's life: correspondence with world leaders, photographs with renowned artists, journals detailing thoughts on everything from politics to philosophy. Most intriguing were her notes on Richard Blackwood and his investment firm, Blackwood Capital. She'd been systematically tracking his activities for nearly 2 years before her death, documenting discrepancies in reported returns, tracing money through a labyrinth of shell companies, and noting connections to several prominent Bostonians, including, to my shock, Olivia's father, James Westfield. I hadn't seen or spoken to Olivia since that rainy November day. Occasionally, I glimpsed her in society pages, on Richard's arm at galas and charity events, her smile radiant, her jewelry expensive. Each time, the wound reopened slightly before scabbing over again. Then came the headlines that changed everything. Blackwood Capital under federal investigation. Investors panic as Blackwood freezes redemptions. EC alleges massive fraud at Blackwood Capital. I watched the implosion with detached fascination, piecing together what had happened from news reports and my grandmother's files. Richard had been running something close to a Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay existing clients while siphoning millions into offshore accounts. When markets turned against him, the house of cards collapsed. It was on a muggy July evening that my doorbell rang. I'd spent the day at the harborfront site and had just settled into my apartment with takeout and architectural plans. Not expecting anyone, I approached the door cautiously and checked the peephole. Olivia stood in the hallway. My heart lurched traitorously in my chest. She looked different, thinner, her designer clothes replaced by a simple sundress, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail rather than the sleek bob she'd adopted during her time with Richard. For a moment, I considered pretending I wasn't home. Then, cursing my weakness, I opened the door. "Michael." Her voice caught slightly. Up close, I could see the shadows under her eyes, carefully concealed with makeup but visible nonetheless. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced. Can I come in?" I stepped aside wordlessly, allowing her into the apartment that still bore faint traces of our life together, though I'd replaced most of the furniture and repainted the walls. "You've redecorated," she observed, glancing around. "It looks nice. What do you want, Olivia?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She twisted her hands together, a nervous gesture I remembered from when we'd first started dating. "I've been thinking about us. About the mistakes I made. Let me guess. This sudden nostalgia coincides with Richard's financial collapse." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I couldn't help it. She flinched. "That's not fair. Isn't it? 6 months of silence, and you appear the week after your boyfriend is exposed as a fraud. Seems like quite a coincidence." "It's not like that," she insisted, though her eyes slid away from mine. "Things with Richard, they weren't what I thought they'd be. Even before the investigation, I was planning to leave. And now you have. Conveniently, just as his assets are being frozen." "I deserve that," she conceded, sinking onto my couch. "But it doesn't change how I feel. Being with Richard made me realize what I'd thrown away. We had something real, Michael. Something that mattered." I studied her face, searching for sincerity and finding, what? Genuine regret? Calculated desperation? Perhaps a mixture of both. "What exactly are you proposing here, Olivia?" I asked quietly. She leaned forward, her eyes suddenly bright with intensity. "A second chance. For both of us. I know I hurt you terribly, and I'll spend as long as it takes making that up to you. But what we had, it was worth fighting for." A bitter laugh escaped me. "And yet you didn't fight for it. You walked away for someone wealthier." "I made a horrible mistake," she whispered. "I got caught up in what Richard represented, success, security, status. But it was all smoke and mirrors. And I wasn't successful enough," I reminded her. "I was wrong," she said simply. "About so many things. I heard your firm won the harborfront project. That's amazing, Michael. I always believed in your talent. Just not enough to stay, I thought, but didn't say. I should go," she said after a lengthy silence. "This was probably a mistake. But I want you to know I'm sorry. Truly sorry." She stood, smoothing her dress. Maybe we could get coffee sometime? Just to talk. I should have said no. Should have closed the door on the past once and for all. But some traitor part of me that still remembered the good times, her laugh, her passion, the way she'd once believed in my dreams, nodded instead. I'll call you, I said, knowing even as the words left my mouth that I was setting myself up for another betrayal. Only this time I wouldn't be the same man she'd left behind. 3 days after Olivia's unexpected appearance at my apartment, we met for coffee at a small cafe in Back Bay. The conversation was stilted at first, painful small talk about mutual acquaintances and Boston weather, before gradually easing into something resembling our old rhythm. She spoke of her brief time with Richard, careful to emphasize her disillusionment had begun well before his downfall. He was cold, she admitted, stirring her latte absently. Everything was transactional to him. Even relationships. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while silently noting the irony of her complaint. Hadn't she approached our relationship with similar calculation in the end? I've missed you, she said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Missed us. It would have been easy to fall back into old patterns. Despite everything, some part of me still responded to her. The familiar scent of her perfume, the way she tilted her head when listening intently, the soft curve of her smile. But my grandmother's letter, which I'd read dozens of times over the past months, echoed in my mind. Trust must be earned twice and can be broken once. I'm working on a new project, I said, gently withdrawing my hand. Something personal. I'd like to show it to you. Her eyes brightened with interest. I'd love to see it. The next afternoon, I picked her up in my new car, a sleek black Audi that represented one of the few visible changes I'd allowed myself since inheriting my grandmother's fortune. Olivia noticed immediately, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. The harborfront project came with a significant bonus, I explained with a shrug, the lie coming easily. I figured after driving the same Honda for 10 years, I deserved an upgrade. It suits you, she said, running her hand appreciatively over the leather interior. You always had excellent taste. I drove us through the city toward Beacon Hill, enjoying her growing confusion as we passed increasingly prestigious addresses. Where exactly is this project of yours? She asked finally. Just ahead, I replied, turning onto Lewisburg Square, one of the most exclusive streets in Boston. The historic square with its iron-fenced garden was lined with impeccably maintained federal-style brick townhouses, each worth millions. I pulled up in front of my grandmother's mansion, now my mansion, and cut the engine. This is it? I nodded, enjoying her bewilderment. Come on. I'll show you around. The house was a 5-story architectural masterpiece dating back to the early 19th century, with a classic red brick facade, black shutters, and a deep green front door. I unlocked it with the heavy brass key I now carried everywhere, gesturing for Olivia to enter first. Her sharp intake of breath as she stepped into the marble-floored foyer was everything I'd anticipated. The entrance hall opened onto a grand staircase and showcased original crown moldings, crystal chandeliers, and museum-quality artwork. Michael, she whispered, her eyes wide. What is this place? Whose house is this? Mine, I said simply. She turned to stare at me. I don't understand. My grandmother left it to me, along with everything in it. I moved past her into the main sitting room, with its soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. Your grandmother? She repeated, following me. You mean the one who lived in that old house in Cambridge? That was my maternal grandmother, I explained, watching her carefully. This belonged to my father's mother, Eleanor Harrington. Harrington? Wait, not the Eleanor Harrington? The philanthropist. I nodded. The very same. But you never mentioned that my grandmother was one of the wealthiest women in Boston? I finished for her. No, I didn't. She valued privacy and genuine connections. The implication hung in the air between us. Olivia had met my grandmother exactly once, at a family dinner early in our relationship. She'd been polite but reserved with the elderly woman, clearly viewing her as unimportant to our future. How differently she might have behaved had she known. When did you inherit all this? She asked, her voice carefully controlled as she took in the exquisite furnishings, the subtle signs of tremendous wealth that permeated every inch of the mansion. Last November, I replied. The week you left, actually. Her face paled. The same week. The very next day, to be precise. Interesting timing, isn't it? She sank onto an antique settee, looking stunned. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That the man you just deemed not successful enough had suddenly inherited a fortune? What would have been the point? I would have. Come back sooner? I suggested, my voice gentle despite the cruelty of the words. Like you did when Richard's empire crumbled? Tears welled in her eyes. That's not fair. Perhaps not, I conceded, moving to the window to gaze out at the immaculately maintained garden. But it is honest. After a moment, she joined me at the window, her composure partially restored. It's an extraordinary house, she said quietly. What are your plans for it? I turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I'm hosting a dinner party next weekend. I'd like you to attend. Bring Richard. Her eyes widened. Richard? But why would you want? Let's just say I have some business matters to discuss with him, I replied. And several other guests who might interest you. Old friends. New connections. What kind of business matters? She asked cautiously. I merely smiled. 7 o'clock next Saturday. Formal attire. I'll send a proper invitation. As I drove her home later, Olivia's demeanor had shifted subtly, her attention more focused, her laughter more deliberate, her questions about my life and plans more pointed. I answered selectively, revealing only what served my purpose. By the time I dropped her off, I had no doubt she would attend my dinner party. And bring Richard Blackwood exactly as requested. The formal invitations went out the next morning, heavy cream cardstock embossed with the Harrington family crest, delivered by courier rather than mail. 7 in total, each carefully chosen. Richard and Olivia received the first, naturally. The second went to James Westfield, Olivia's father and my former mentor at the prestigious architectural firm where I'd begun my career. James had once praised my innovative designs, right before taking credit for them on the waterfront tower project that had launched him to national prominence 3 years ago. The third invitation went to Patricia and Howard Harrington, my parents, who had distanced themselves from Eleanor years ago over some mysterious family rift. They had expressed only perfunctory interest in my inheritance, though I suspected their indifference masked deeper resentment. The fourth went to Senator Malcolm Reynolds and his wife Victoria, longtime family friends of my grandmother and major investors in Blackwood Capital. The fifth to Dr. Elizabeth Chin, the medical examiner who had certified my grandmother's death and Diana's sister. The final invitation was addressed to Detective Diana Chin herself. I was examining the blueprints for the mansion's century-old wine cellar when Diana called. A dinner party? She said without preamble. That's your play? Would you prefer I confront a potential financial criminal directly? I replied, smiling though she couldn't see it. Besides, I thought you might appreciate the opportunity to observe several persons of interest in a social setting. This isn't a game, Michael, she said, her voice sharp. These people could be dangerous. If Richard Blackwood realizes you're investigating him. I'm not investigating anyone, I interrupted smoothly. I'm simply hosting a gathering of people connected to my grandmother. As her heir, it seems appropriate. Diana sighed. Including James Westfield? The man who stole your designs and nearly destroyed your career? That seems less about honoring Eleanor and more about settling scores. I'd forgotten how thorough her knowledge of my life was. Of course my grandmother would have told her about that betrayal. Perhaps, I conceded. But Westfield invested heavily with Blackwood. If anyone knows where the missing money went, it would be him. And you think he'll just confess over cocktails and canapés? People reveal more than they realize in social settings, I said. Especially when they believe themselves among friends. There was a long pause before Diana spoke again. You're more like Eleanor than I realized. She could be ruthless when necessary. I'll take that as a compliment. It wasn't entirely meant as one, she replied dryly. Your grandmother's methods sometimes created collateral damage. Just be careful. After hanging up, I descended to the mansion's basement, where I'd set up a makeshift investigation room. On one wall, I'd pinned photographs of each invited guest, connected by red string to relevant documents and news clippings. My focus kept returning to an architectural rendering of the waterfront tower, my design, though James Westfield's name appeared on the plans. I discovered preliminary sketches in my grandmother's safe, alongside evidence that she'd been quietly documenting the theft. Why hadn't she told me? What had she been planning before death interrupted? The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. I checked my security monitor, surprised to see Olivia on my doorstep, alone and earlier than we'd arranged to meet. I didn't expect you until this evening, I said, opening the door. She offered a tentative smile. I wanted to talk to you. Alone. About the dinner party. I led her to the sitting room, noting her appreciative glances at the antiques and artwork we passed. Today she wore an understated burgundy dress that highlighted her figure without appearing overtly seductive. A calculated choice, no doubt. Richard isn't thrilled about the invitation, she said once we were seated, accepting the sparkling water I offered. With everything happening at Blackwood Capital, he's preoccupied. I imagine being investigated for fraud would be quite consuming, I replied mildly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Nothing's been proven. The media exaggerates everything. Of course. Though my grandmother seemed quite convinced. What do you mean? She asked, setting her glass down carefully. Eleanor was investigating Blackwood Capital before she died, I explained, watching her reaction closely. She left quite extensive files. Apparently, she was concerned about certain investment practices. And you've reviewed these files? Her voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened around the glass. Thoroughly, I lied. In truth, I'd only begun to understand the complex financial machinations documented in my grandmother's meticulous notes. Olivia leaned forward. Michael, you need to be careful. Richard has powerful connections. If he thought you were somehow involved in the investigation. Is that concern for me I hear? I interrupted, unable to keep the edge from my voice. How touching. She flinched. Despite what you might believe, I do care what happens to you. Just not enough to stay when you thought I was struggling financially. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken accusations. I made a mistake, she said finally. A terrible one. But is punishing me really worth putting yourself at risk? I studied her face, wondering how much was genuine concern and how much was self-preservation. The woman I'd loved was still visible beneath the calculated exterior, the slight tremble of her lower lip, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous. The dinner party isn't about punishment, Olivia, I said softly. It's about truth. And closure. And Richard? Why insist on his presence? I smiled enigmatically. Let's just say he has something I want. What could you possibly want from a man under federal investigation? Answers, I replied simply. About investments, partnerships, connections. Your father's name appears in my grandmother's files quite prominently. Did you know that? The color drained from her face. Dad? What does he have to do with this? That, I said, rising to signal the end of our conversation, is exactly what Saturday's gathering will reveal. The day before the dinner party, I woke before dawn. Sleep had become elusive lately, my mind constantly churning with plans, contingencies, and memories. I made coffee and carried it to my grandmother's study, now mine though I still thought of it as hers. The room was my favorite in the mansion, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a massive mahogany desk positioned to catch the morning light. Above the marble fireplace hung a portrait of Eleanor in her prime, formidable in pearls and a navy suit, her eyes sharp with intelligence. Am I doing the right thing, grandmother? I asked the empty room, half expecting her portrait to answer. Instead, I opened the top desk drawer where I kept her letter. The paper had grown soft from repeated handling, the ink slightly faded at the creases. I unfolded it carefully and read the familiar words. My dearest Michael. If you're reading this, I've left this world and placed a considerable burden on your shoulders. For that, I apologize, but you were always the one person I could trust without reservation. The fortune I've left you comes with responsibility, not just to maintain it but to use it wisely. Money amplifies character, Michael. It doesn't change it. Remember that when former friends and distant relatives suddenly discover their affection for you. There is a matter I was unable to complete in my lifetime that I now entrust to you. In my safe, your birth date is the combination. You'll find documentation of financial irregularities at Blackwood Capital. I believe Richard Blackwood and several of his associates, including James Westfield, have been systematically defrauding investors, myself included, for years. I had planned to bring this evidence to light, but illness accelerated faster than expected. Be cautious in how you proceed. These men are powerful and unscrupulous. Diana has instructions to assist you should you choose to pursue this matter. Trust must be earned twice and can be broken once. Let this guide you in the days ahead. With enduring love and faith in your judgment, Eleanor. I folded the letter and returned it to the drawer. My grandmother had been investigating Richard for financial fraud, yes, but she'd also been documenting James Westfield's theft of my architectural designs. The connection between the two men went deeper than I'd initially realized. According to her notes, James had provided architectural services far below market rate to Blackwood Capital projects in exchange for preferential investment opportunities. Opportunities that had likely wiped out his savings when Blackwood collapsed. The household staff, a team I'd inherited along with the mansion, arrived at 9 to begin preparations for tomorrow's dinner. Mrs. Sullivan, the housekeeper who had served my grandmother for 30 years, supervised with military precision. The florist will deliver arrangements at 3, she informed me, consulting her clipboard. Chef Auguste wants to confirm the menu changes you requested. I nodded, still distracted by thoughts of my grandmother's letter. The substitutions for the main course are fine. And make sure we use the Baccarat crystal and the Sèvres china. Grandmother would have wanted this dinner to be memorable. Mrs. Sullivan's eyes, faded blue but still sharp, studied me carefully. She would be pleased to see you settling in, Mr. Harrington. This house needed a proper heir. Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan. Though I'm not certain she would approve of all my plans. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Miss Eleanor believed in justice, sir. Even when it required unorthodox methods. I looked at her with newfound interest. How much did she tell you? Enough to know that tomorrow's guest list is no coincidence, she replied calmly. The staff are prepared for any eventuality. By mid-afternoon, the mansion had transformed. Flowers adorned every surface, their subtle fragrance perfuming the air. Candles waited in silver holders, crystals sparkled, and linens so fine they were nearly translucent draped the dining table. I had spared no expense, wanting the evening to reflect the wealth and power that now stood behind me. At 4, Diana arrived earlier than the 7 o'clock meeting we'd arranged. I wanted to see the battlefield before the war begins, she explained, following me through the house. Impressive staging. Psychological advantage, I replied. Richard and James will be off balance, surrounded by reminders of old money and stability, everything Blackwood Capital falsely promised its investors. She nodded approvingly. You've thought this through. But I'm still not clear on your endgame. What exactly do you hope to accomplish tomorrow night? Confession. Accountability. Maybe even restitution for those who lost everything in Richard's scheme. And revenge? She asked quietly. I paused before the portrait of my grandmother. Justice isn't revenge, Diana. It can be, depending on the motivation. She studied my face. Just remember that Eleanor wanted the truth exposed, not personal vendettas settled. The truth is my vendetta, I replied. For what they did to my grandmother, to me, to all the investors who trusted them. Diana's expression softened slightly. Your grandmother would be proud of your principles, Michael. Just be careful they don't blind you to unexpected consequences. She glanced at her watch. I should go prepare for tomorrow. 7 o'clock. Actually, I'd appreciate if you came at 6. There's something in the safe I'd like you to review before the others arrive. After she left, I returned to the basement investigation room for a final review. Each photograph, each document, each connection reflected hours of research and planning. Everything was in place. Tomorrow the truth would finally emerge. And nothing would ever be the same again. 6 o'clock arrived with darkening skies and the promise of a summer storm. Diana came precisely on time, dressed in a fitted midnight blue gown that transformed her from detective to elegant dinner guest. Only the alertness in her eyes betrayed her professional assessment of the surroundings. You clean up well, I said, leading her to the study. So do you, she replied, glancing at my tailored tuxedo. Though I'm still not convinced this theatrical approach is necessary. I opened the safe behind my grandmother's portrait and removed a thick manila envelope. This arrived yesterday from the forensic accountant I hired. It confirms what my grandmother suspected and expands on her findings. Diana examined the contents, her expression growing increasingly grave. This is damning, Michael. Bank transfers, shell companies, falsified returns. There's enough here to ensure federal prosecution. Notice the names of the account holders for the Cayman Islands transfers, I said, pointing to a highlighted section. Her eyes widened. James Westfield authorized these? With Senator Reynolds as co-signer. Exactly. The corruption goes deeper than just Blackwood Capital. My grandmother was documenting a network of fraud and professional favors that spans Boston's elite. Including your parents, Diana noted quietly, indicating their names on a list of secondary investors. Did you know? Not until I saw these documents, I admitted. Though it explains their distance these past years. Perhaps they suspected my grandmother was investigating. At 6:30, Mrs. Sullivan announced the first guests had arrived. My parents entered the foyer with the practiced poise of people accustomed to wealth. My mother's eyes widened slightly at the renovations I'd made, while my father's gaze remained cool and assessing. Michael, my mother said, air-kissing my cheek. The house looks wonderful. Your grandmother would be pleased. Would she? I asked mildly. I wasn't sure you'd know, considering how rarely you visited her. My father's expression tightened. This evening isn't the place for family grievances. On the contrary, I replied, it's exactly the place. But we'll save that conversation for dinner. I turned to Diana. May I introduce Detective Diana Chin? Grandmother's goddaughter. My parents exchanged alarmed glances at the word detective, but maintained their social smiles. The doorbell rang again. James Westfield arrived alone, his once commanding presence diminished. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and new lines creased his face, the look of a man under significant stress. Michael, he said, extending his hand. Quite a place you've inherited. Your grandmother had exquisite taste. I shook his hand briefly. She had excellent judgment in many areas, though perhaps not in those she trusted. James's smile faltered. I've been meaning to call you. About the harborfront project. Your work is exceptional as always. I'd like to discuss a potential collaboration. Now that your Blackwood Capital investments have evaporated? I suggested. Interesting timing. Before he could respond, Senator Reynolds and his wife arrived, followed closely by Dr. Elizabeth Chen. I made introductions as Mrs. Sullivan directed everyone to the drawing room for cocktails. At 7:15, with still no sign of Olivia and Richard, murmurs of impatience began circulating among the guests. I was about to ask Mrs. Sullivan to serve the first course without them when the doorbell rang. They entered like a couple from a fashion magazine, Richard tall and commanding in a bespoke tuxedo, Olivia radiant in a champagne-colored gown that caught the light with every movement. But beneath their polished exterior, I noted signs of strain, the tightness around Richard's eyes, the slight tremor in Olivia's hands. Michael, Richard said, his voice projecting confidence his eyes didn't match. Magnificent home. I had no idea you were connected to the Harrington fortune. Few people did, I replied. My grandmother valued privacy, especially regarding her financial affairs. His smile dimmed slightly at the emphasis on financial affairs. I led everyone to the dining room, where Mrs. Sullivan had arranged place cards with careful consideration of dynamics. Richard sat directly across from me with Olivia to my right and James to my left. My parents flanked Richard, with Diana and her sister at the ends of the table. As servers presented the first course, a chilled lobster bisque, I raised my wine glass. To my grandmother, Eleanor Harrington, whose generosity made this evening possible. To Eleanor, they echoed, though several voices lacked conviction. Richard, ever the financier, initiated conversation about the art market, clearly trying to establish common ground. I've always had an appreciation for fine art as an investment vehicle. That Monet in your foyer must have appreciated considerably. Some things aren't meant to be investment vehicles, Richard, I replied. My grandmother collected art because it spoke to her, not because of potential returns. Of course, he conceded smoothly. Though prudent investing allowed her to pursue such passions. Speaking of investments, Senator Reynolds interjected. I heard troubling rumors about Blackwood Capital. Surely the media has exaggerated the situation? A tense silence fell over the table. Richard's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Olivia's knuckles whitened around her water glass. I believe Michael might have insights on that matter, James Westfield said unexpectedly, his gaze challenging me across crystal and candlelight. Given his newfound interest in finance. Actually, I replied, voice deliberately casual, I do have some thoughts on the subject. Perhaps we should discuss them over the main course. As the servers cleared the soup bowls and prepared to bring out the next dish, I caught Diana's subtle nod of approval. Like players in a meticulously choreographed drama, each guest was unwittingly moving toward the revelation I had planned. The storm outside chose that moment to announce itself with a distant rumble of thunder, nature's perfect accompaniment to the tempest I was about to unleash. The main course arrived, roasted duck with cherry reduction, served on my grandmother's priceless Sèvres china. As the servers poured wine, I observed my guests with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching specimens in a laboratory. Richard maintained his facade of confidence, though his eyes darted occasionally to the exits. Olivia smiled too brightly, her laughter a pitch higher than natural. My parents exchanged subtle glances, a silent conversation built on decades of complicity. You mentioned insights into Blackwood Capital, Senator Reynolds prompted, cutting into his duck with practiced precision. I'd be curious to hear your perspective, Michael. As an outsider to finance. The slight emphasis on outsider was deliberate, a reminder that despite my inheritance I wasn't part of their world. Little did he know how thoroughly I'd mapped that world through my grandmother's files. I wouldn't call myself an outsider, I replied, taking a deliberate sip of wine. Not when my grandmother was one of Blackwood Capital's earliest investors. Richard's knife scraped against china. Eleanor was an investor? I don't recall her name on our client lists. She invested through a trust, I explained. The Lewisburg Foundation. Perhaps that rings a bell? The color drained from Richard's face. The Lewisburg Foundation had been Blackwood Capital's largest institutional investor, with over $50 million at stake. Eleanor controlled Lewisburg? James asked, his voice strained. She never mentioned. My grandmother kept many things private, I interrupted. Including her suspicions about certain financial irregularities she observed at Blackwood Capital. A charged silence descended on the table. Lightning flashed outside, momentarily illuminating faces frozen in various stages of alarm. What exactly are you implying, Michael? My father demanded, setting down his fork with deliberate control. I'm not implying anything, I replied calmly. I'm stating facts. Eleanor Harrington spent the last 2 years of her life documenting what appears to be systematic fraud at Blackwood Capital, facilitated by a network of Boston's most respected citizens. I nodded to Mrs. Sullivan, who appeared with a leather portfolio. From it, I withdrew copies of selected documents and slid them toward each guest. Bank transfers to Cayman accounts. Falsified returns. Fabricated investment properties. I ticked off each item as my guests stared at the evidence before them. A pattern of deception that has cost investors millions. Richard's expression hardened. This is absurd. You're an architect, not a financial investigator. Whatever amateur conclusions you've drawn. They're not my conclusions, I cut in. They're the findings of both my grandmother and the forensic accountant I hired to verify her work. The same findings that have been submitted to the SEC and FBI. Olivia gasped softly. Michael, you can't be serious. Deadly serious, I assured her, then turned to her father. Perhaps most interesting is how the architectural contracts for Blackwood's development projects connect to these financial irregularities. Would you care to explain that, James? James Westfield's face had gone ashen. This is hardly the venue for discussing how you stole my designs for the waterfront tower? I suggested. Or how you provided below-market architectural services to Blackwood projects in exchange for preferential investment access? You have no proof of those allegations, he snapped, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Actually, Diana interjected, speaking for the first time since dinner began, the documentation is quite comprehensive. Eleanor Harrington was remarkably thorough in building her case. And who exactly are you? Richard demanded, glaring at Diana. She smiled thinly. Detective Diana Chen, Boston Police Department, Financial Crimes Unit. Currently assisting the federal investigation into Blackwood Capital. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Victoria Reynolds dropped her wine glass, spreading a crimson stain across the immaculate tablecloth. My mother pressed her napkin to her lips, eyes wide with undisguised panic. This is outrageous, Senator Reynolds blustered. A police officer misrepresenting herself at a private dinner party? I'll have your badge for this. I was invited as Eleanor Harrington's goddaughter, which I am, Diana replied coolly. And I've misrepresented nothing. Every person at this table is connected to the Blackwood Capital fraud, though in varying degrees of complicity. I turned to my parents. Even you, though I suspect your involvement was more ignorance than active participation. Grandmother's notes suggest you invested based on James's recommendation, without due diligence. My father's face hardened. You have no right to judge our financial decisions. No, I agreed, but the SEC does. And they'll be particularly interested in how Senate Banking Committee information made its way to Blackwood executives through Senator Reynolds. The senator half rose from his chair. That's a damned lie. Is it? I slid another document toward him, a copy of an email from his private account to Richard, containing confidential committee discussions. My grandmother had extraordinary resources at her disposal, including certain technological assistance. Richard pushed back from the table abruptly. This farce has gone on long enough. I don't know what game you're playing, Harrington, but you'll regret making an enemy of me. Sit down, Richard, I said quietly. We haven't reached the most interesting part yet. And what would that be? He sneered. I smiled. The part where I explain exactly how my grandmother discovered your fraud in the first place, and why she made me her heir instead of her own son. Thunder crashed directly overhead as if nature itself were punctuating my words. In that momentary darkness, I glimpsed what my grandmother must have seen. Not Boston's elite, but desperate people clinging to wealth and status by any means necessary. And I finally understood why she had chosen me to bring them to justice. Richard slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his confident facade cracking like ice in spring. The dining room fell silent except for the storm raging outside, matching the emotional tempest within. Eleanor Harrington was many things, I began, but most of all she was observant. 2 years ago she noticed discrepancies in her Lewisburg Foundation returns, small at first, but concerning enough to warrant investigation. I rose and walked to the sideboard, retrieving an aged bottle of cognac and 7 crystal snifters. Meticulous service in the face of chaos, another lesson from my grandmother. She hired private financial investigators, I continued, pouring a measure of amber liquid into each glass. But she also employed more personal methods of research. I placed a snifter before Richard, whose fingers betrayed a slight tremor as he reached for it. What methods? He asked, voice tight. She attended the same charity events you frequented. Arranged to be seated near you at fundraisers. Cultivated friendships with your clients. I smiled thinly. And she hired me to design a house you believed was for one of your foreign investors. Olivia gasped. The Singapore project? That was your design. Under a pseudonym, I confirmed. My grandmother wanted Richard to speak freely around the architect, never suspecting it was her grandson gathering information. James Westfield's face contorted with anger. You used our professional relationship to spy? How ironic, I replied coldly, that you should be offended by the breach of professional ethics, considering you stole my waterfront tower designs and claimed them as your own. That's a gross simplification, James protested. Your concepts were unrefined, unrealistic. Yet valuable enough to steal, I finished for him. Just as the confidential banking committee information was valuable enough for Senator Reynolds to leak to Richard in exchange for preferential investment opportunities. The senator's fist crashed down on the table. You have no proof of any arrangement. But I do, Diana interjected. The digital trail is quite comprehensive. Eleanor was methodical in building her case before her illness accelerated. This vendetta against successful people is absurd, my father snapped. Eleanor always resented those who achieved what she couldn't. I laughed outright at this. Grandmother was worth over $300 million. She funded hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. What exactly did she fail to achieve? Respect, my mother said quietly. The old Boston families never fully accepted her, despite her wealth. That's why she became so obsessive about exposing others' flaws. Is that how you justify your complicity? I asked. By painting her as vindictive rather than principled? An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. What exactly do you want, Michael? Richard finally asked, his voice surprisingly steady. Money? Revenge? Public humiliation? Justice, I replied simply. For my grandmother, whose final months were consumed by unraveling your fraud. For the investors who lost everything while you hid millions offshore. For the careers you've destroyed to protect your schemes. Richard's expression hardened. You're naive. This won't end well for anyone, yourself included. The system protects its own. Not always, Diana said. The federal prosecutors have been building their case independently of Michael's evidence. Arrests are imminent. As if summoned by her words, headlights swept across the dining room windows. Multiple vehicles pulled up to the mansion, their blue and red lights pulsing through the rain. What have you done? Senator Reynolds demanded, half rising from his chair. I didn't do anything, I replied calmly. But it appears the FBI has questions about certain matters we've been discussing. This is a setup, Richard snarled, abruptly standing. A coordinated attack. Olivia reached for his arm. Richard, please? He shook her off violently, sending her stumbling backward. Did you know about this? He demanded. Were you part of it? Of course not, she protested, eyes wide with genuine fear. The doorbell rang, its sonorous chime echoing through the mansion. Mrs. Sullivan appeared in the doorway. Sir, federal agents are requesting entry. I nodded. Show them in, please. The dining room erupted in chaos. Senator Reynolds attempted to call someone on his phone before Diana firmly confiscated it. My parents huddled together, whispering urgently. James Westfield sat frozen, staring blankly at the evidence documents. Richard, seeing his world collapse around him, lunged toward me with unexpected speed. You self-righteous bastard, he growled, grabbing my lapels. You have no idea what you've done. I didn't resist, merely met his gaze steadily. I know exactly what I've done. The question is, do you? Before he could respond, federal agents flooded the room, professionally separating the combatants. Special Agent Larson, whom I'd met during my cooperation with their investigation, approached Richard. Richard Blackwood, James Westfield, Senator Malcolm Reynolds, she announced, her voice carrying over the commotion. You're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. As the agents read Miranda rights and applied handcuffs, I caught Olivia's stunned expression across the room. Tears streamed silently down her face as she watched the man she'd chosen over me being led away in handcuffs. Her eyes met mine, filled with questions, accusations, and something that might have been regret. You knew, she whispered. You knew all along this would happen tonight. I didn't answer. Some revelations required no explanation. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, much like the clouds of deception that had hung over my grandmother's final investigation. As the federal agents escorted their suspects from the mansion, I felt not triumph, but a deep, complicated sense of completion. The truth was finally exposed. But the cost remained to be calculated. In the aftermath of the arrests, the mansion fell into an eerie silence. The remaining guests had departed quickly, my parents with cold fury, Dr. Chen with a sympathetic nod, and Olivia after a long, unreadable look that haunted me still. Only Diana remained, helping me gather the evidence documents scattered across the dining table like the wreckage of multiple lives. You handled that well, she said, organizing papers into neat stacks. Though I suspect the fallout is just beginning. I nodded, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the evening had evaporated, leaving bone-deep weariness in its wake. My grandmother's notes mentioned my parents' involvement was peripheral. Do you think they'll face charges? Diana considered this. Unlikely for criminal prosecution, but civil liability is possible. The Blackwood investors will be looking for recovery anywhere they can find it. They were warned, I said, remembering my grandmother's meticulous documentation of conversations where she'd questioned Blackwood's suspiciously high returns. They chose willful blindness. Most people do when profit is involved, Diana replied. She hesitated, then added, You realize Olivia will be implicated as well? As Richard's partner, she benefited from the proceeds of fraud, even if she wasn't directly involved. The thought sent a pang through me that I hadn't anticipated. Despite everything, some part of me still cared what happened to her. She didn't know, I said with more certainty than I felt. Olivia is many things, but she's not a financial criminal. Diana's expression remained neutral. That will be for the courts to decide. After she left, I poured myself another cognac and wandered through the silent mansion. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air fresh and clean. I opened the French doors to the garden, breathing in the scent of wet earth and roses, my grandmother's favorite flowers, meticulously maintained by the gardener she'd employed for decades. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. A single line, We need to talk. Please, Olivia. I hesitated, then replied, Beacon Hill Cafe. 10 tomorrow morning. Sleep eluded me that night. I kept replaying the evening's events, seeing Richard's face as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, hearing my father's bitter accusations, feeling Olivia's wounded stare across the chaos. Had justice been served, or had I simply perpetuated a cycle of hurt under the guise of righteousness? Dawn found me in my grandmother's study, reading her journals from the period when she'd first discovered the fraud. Her writing revealed not vindictiveness but genuine dismay at the corruption she'd uncovered. How does one maintain faith in humanity, she'd written, when those entrusted with others' financial futures treat trust as a commodity to be exploited? The morning news was dominated by the arrests. Financial scandal rocks Boston elite, proclaimed the headline. Richards and Senator Reynolds' faces glared from the screen as reporters detailed the charges against them. James Westfield received less attention, mentioned only as a prominent architect also implicated in the scheme. At precisely 10 I entered the Beacon Hill Cafe. Olivia was already there, seated at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug as if seeking warmth despite the summer morning. She wore oversized sunglasses and simple clothes, jeans and a white blouse, so different from her usual carefully curated appearance. Thank you for coming, she said as I sat across from her. Her voice was hoarse, suggesting a night without sleep. How are you holding up? I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything. She removed her sunglasses, revealing reddened eyes. They froze all of Richard's accounts. Our accounts. The FBI searched our apartment at dawn. A bitter laugh escaped her. They even took my laptop and phone. Apparently, I'm a person of interest in their investigation. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. For what it's worth, I told Detective Chin you weren't involved. But wasn't I? She traced the rim of her coffee cup, not meeting my eyes. Maybe not in the fraud, but in all of it. I chose Richard because of what he represented: wealth, success, status. I benefited from money that was stolen from others, including your grandmother. I said nothing, letting her continue. The worst part, she whispered, is that I knew something wasn't right. The lifestyle, the returns on my father's investments, it was all too perfect. Too easy. She finally looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. I ignored my instincts because I wanted to believe I'd made the right choice when I left you. The admission hung between us, weighted with all our shared history. What will you do now? I asked. I don't know. My father's reputation is destroyed. Our assets are frozen. The law firm where I work has put me on administrative leave. She wiped away a tear that had escaped. I may have to sell my jewelry just to make rent. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. You could have warned me, she said quietly. Before the dinner. Before I brought Richard into your trap. Would you have believed me? I countered. Or would you have warned him? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I need to know something, I said after a pause. When you came back to me after Richard's firm started collapsing but before the arrests, was that real? Or was it your contingency plan? Olivia's eyes met mine, a flash of the honesty we'd once shared passing between us. Both, she admitted. I did miss you. What we had was real, Michael. But I also knew Richard was in trouble and I was hedging my bets. Her candor was oddly refreshing after months of manipulation and deceit. I appreciate your honesty, I said. Finally. She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of mine. Is there any way forward from here? For us. Outside the cafe window, federal agents escorted Richard Blackwood, handcuffed and unshaven, from a black SUV into the federal courthouse across the street. The sight was my answer. The weeks following the arrests unfolded like scenes from a film I was both directing and reluctantly starring in. Richard's and Senator Reynolds' faces dominated news cycles, their perp walks and courthouse appearances dissected by financial analysts and social commentators alike. James Westfield accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against the others in exchange for reduced charges. My parents retreated to their vacation home in Vermont, refusing all contact. And I found myself the unexpected steward of not just my grandmother's fortune, but her legacy of truth-seeking. The mansion, once a symbol of my plan for justice, now felt cavernous and empty. I wandered its halls at night, my footsteps echoing through rooms filled with priceless artifacts but devoid of genuine connection. The vindication I'd expected felt hollow, tainted by the collateral damage I hadn't fully anticipated. Detective Chin stopped by occasionally, updating me on the case's progress. Richard's lawyers are fighting hard, she told me one evening as we shared tea in the study. But the evidence is overwhelming. The forensic accountants have traced over $70 million in investor funds to his personal accounts. And Olivia? I asked, trying to sound merely curious. Diana's expression softened. Cooperating fully. The prosecutors are satisfied she wasn't knowingly involved in the fraud. She studied me over her teacup. You still care about her. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. I care about what happens to her. There's a difference. Is there? Diana set down her cup. You orchestrated an elaborate scheme to expose the people who betrayed you, but you made sure Olivia would be protected from the worst consequences. I exposed people who committed actual crimes, I corrected. Olivia's only crime was poor judgment in men. A crime many have committed, Diana acknowledged with a wry smile. Though few with such spectacular consequences. After she left, I returned to my grandmother's, my study, drawn to the portrait above the fireplace. Eleanor's eyes seemed to follow me, questioning, assessing. Had I honored her intentions? Or had I twisted her pursuit of justice into something more personal and less principled? I opened the drawer where I kept her letter, only to find a second envelope I hadn't noticed before, tucked beneath the first. It bore the same elegant handwriting, to be opened after justice is served. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, you've followed the evidence to its conclusion. The truth has emerged as it inevitably must. I hope it has brought you the closure I believe you seek. But justice, while necessary, is rarely sufficient for healing. In exposing others' wrongdoing, we risk becoming defined by their actions rather than our own. Revenge conceals itself as righteousness, borrowing virtue's language while serving baser instincts. I pursued this investigation not from vindictiveness, but from a belief that trust violated must be accounted for. Yet I've questioned my motives often, especially as illness clarified what truly matters at life's end. Not victories over enemies but connections with those we love. Not rightness but peace. The fortune I've left you offers freedom few ever know. Choose wisely how to use it. Build rather than destroy. Create rather than expose. And remember that while justice concerns itself with the past, mercy looks toward the future. With enduring love, Eleanor. I sat with the letter until dawn, my grandmother's words echoing through my consciousness. Had I confused justice with revenge? Had my desire to see Richard and James pay for their betrayals overshadowed the principles my grandmother had championed? As the first light of morning filtered through the windows, I made a decision. I would attend Richard's arraignment that day. The federal courthouse was crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. I slipped into the back row of the gallery just as proceedings began. Richard entered in a prison jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the bespoke suits he'd worn at the height of his power. He moved with diminished confidence, shoulders hunched against the weight of public scrutiny. Across the aisle, I noticed Olivia, dressed soberly in navy blue, her face a careful mask of neutrality. Our eyes met briefly before she looked away, a flush of emotion crossing her features. The charges read like a litany of greed and deception. Securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. Richard pleaded not guilty to all counts, his voice steady but lacking its former authority. As the judge set bail, an astronomical sum reflecting flight risk and the seriousness of the charges, I studied the man I'd helped bring down. Not the invincible financial titan who had stolen Olivia and seemingly everything else I valued, but a flawed, frightened human facing the consequences of his actions. In that moment, something unexpected happened. The burning need for retribution that had driven me for months began to dissipate, replaced by a quieter, more complex emotion. Not forgiveness, I wasn't capable of that yet, but perhaps the beginning of release. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by the rush and noise of Boston at midday, I paused on the steps, breathing deeply. The city continued its rhythms, indifferent to the small dramas playing out within its buildings and institutions. Life moved forward regardless of how tightly we clung to past injuries. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Judgment isn't the end of the story. What comes next matters more. She was right, of course. The question was, what did come next? And who would I choose to be in the aftermath of justice served? 1 year later, I stood at the podium in the newly constructed Eleanor Harrington Center for Architectural Innovation, addressing the inaugural class of scholarship recipients. The autumn sun streamed through the building's innovative glass ceiling, my design, inspired by sketches I'd found among my grandmother's papers. Architecture isn't just about buildings, I told the 20 students whose education would be fully funded through the foundation I'd established. It's about creating spaces where human potential can flourish, where transparency and strength coexist, where beauty serves purpose. I caught Diana's eye in the front row, her smile encouraging. Our friendship had deepened over the months following the arrests, evolving into something neither of us had anticipated but both valued deeply. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the journey I'd undertaken from vengeance to purpose. After the ceremony, we walked through the Boston Public Garden, vibrant with October foliage. Your grandmother would be proud, Diana said, her arm linked through mine. You've honored her legacy in the best possible way. By creating rather than destroying, I said, echoing Eleanor's words from her second letter, the one that had ultimately changed my course. The past year had been transformative in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark days of planning my elaborate revenge. Richard's trial had ended in a 20-year sentence, his empire dismantled and assets liquidated to partially compensate investors. Senator Reynolds had resigned in disgrace before his trial, eventually accepting a plea deal with significant penalties. James Westfield had served 6 months and emerged chastened, his professional reputation in tatters. My parents and I had reached an uneasy reconciliation. Their peripheral involvement in Blackwood's scheme had resulted in substantial financial penalties but no criminal charges. Our relationship remained strained, but the bitter estrangement had given way to cautious connection. I'd sold the mansion, finding its grandeur at odds with the life I now wanted to build. Instead, I'd purchased a contemporary home overlooking the harbor and converted the mansion into a community arts center, preserving Eleanor's legacy while making it accessible to all Bostonians. Have you heard from Olivia? Diana asked, reading my thoughts with her usual perceptiveness. I nodded. She's in New York, working for a nonprofit that helps fraud victims rebuild their financial lives. Ironic, Diana observed. But fitting, I added. She's using her experience to help others avoid similar traps. We reached the small bridge where I'd once proposed to Olivia, in what felt like another lifetime. The memory no longer carried the sharp pain it once had, just a gentle melancholy for dreams that hadn't materialized as planned. Do you ever regret it? Diana asked. Exposing the fraud, knowing how many lives would be affected? I considered the question carefully. I regret my initial motivations. The desire to see people suffer as I had suffered. I paused, watching a swan glide across the pond below. But I don't regret the truth emerging. Some secrets poison everything they touch. Your grandmother used to say that sunshine is the best disinfectant, Diana recalled with a smile. She had a way with words, I agreed. And with seeing the truth in people, both the good and the bad. As we continued our walk, my phone buzzed with a notification. The federal prosecutor's office had approved the victim compensation plan I'd proposed, allocating a significant portion of my inheritance to help those whose savings had been decimated by Blackwood's fraud. It wouldn't restore everything they'd lost, but it might help them rebuild. Good news? Diana asked, noting my expression. The best kind, I replied. The kind that looks forward, not back. Later that evening, as we shared dinner at my harbor home, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me here. From betrayal to inheritance, from revenge to redemption, each step had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand. A penny for your thoughts, Diana said, pouring us each another glass of wine. I was just thinking about what my grandmother wrote, that justice concerns itself with the past, but mercy looks toward the future. I raised my glass in a toast. To the future, then. To the future, she echoed, her eyes holding mine with warmth and promise. Outside, Boston's skyline glittered against the night sky, a city of history and innovation, mistakes and redemption. Somewhere in that urban tapestry stood the buildings I'd designed, structures of glass and steel and purpose that would outlast me, just as my grandmother's values had outlasted her. I had come full circle, from a man defined by what he'd lost to one shaped by what he'd found, not just wealth or justice but understanding. The inheritance that mattered most wasn't the fortune Eleanor had left me, but her reminder that how we respond to betrayal reveals more about our character than the betrayal itself. And in that understanding lay the most valuable legacy of all, the freedom to build a future unconstrained by the injuries of the past. That was the true inheritance. That was the key to the mansion of my own making.